We keep hearing from all the experts in Washington, D.C., the foreign policy experts, our president and our secretary of state. We keep hearing that the only way to resolve the Russia-Ukraine conflict is for full and unconditional surrender and Russia retreat back to Ukraine's original borders. But no one seems to explain exactly how that's going to happen, what that even looks like, and why that has to be the only condition. I certainly don't know, but we've got a war historian here who knows a little thing or two about this sort of stuff. It's Victor Davis Hanson, senior fellow at Hoover Institution. And I know you've just written about this recently, Professor. I mean, they just offhandedly say, oh yeah, that's it, full and unconditional surrender, retreat to the original borders. That includes, by the way, Crimea, which is something that Barack Obama just shrugged over when it happened 10 years ago. So how are they going to achieve this exactly?
I don't think they are. I mean, you make a good point. Until February 24th of 2021, nobody in either the Obama administration, Biden administration, or the Trump administration prior to that invasion had said one of the key elements of U.S. strategy is to get back the Donbass area, the borderlands, and the Crimea back into Ukraine's hand. That only became the central issue after Russia invaded. And I think the reason that they didn't prior to the invasion say that Russia had to give it all back because they had no means to force it to do it, A. And B, they were a little ambiguous because Crimea had been Russian until 1995, since 1781, when they took it from the Ottomans. And the Donbass had been Russian, and it was 70% Russian speaking. And then there was the other problem that Western Ukraine had only been Ukrainian since 1946, 45. It was stolen by Stalin from the Poles when they invaded Poland with Germany in 1939. And then after the war, they demanded that be given to Ukraine, and after 1,000 years of Polish speakers. So that was that famous quote. You remember the Pope said, I don't think that our Roman Catholic brethren should be in Ukraine, and that was conveyed to Stalin. He said, how many divisions does the Pope have?
Right.
So my point is, there's all of these fluid borders that were all mixed up, and Ukraine was kind of contracting and expanding for hundreds of years under different authorities, and all of a sudden we decide, well, this is frozen now, and we're going to force this nuclear power out of Ukraine, and we don't have the wherewithal. I don't think we have the wherewithal to do it, and the Ukrainian army suffered 120 to 130,000 dead, and they're losing 0.6 men to every Russian they're killing, and Russia has 145 million people, and they have 40. So you can see what Putin's doing. It's a war of attrition.
And yet we have drawn this line. We are flexing our muscles. We had Admiral Kirby last week say that if from the China-Russia meeting there came a call for a ceasefire, that our Ukrainian friends should deny it, should refuse it. Who are we to tell them to refuse a ceasefire? But when when America puts its prestige out there like this and says this is what we believe, this is what we stand for, that's supposed to mean something. And now, how can we walk back from it?
I don't know, but I don't think that it's our business to fight a proxy war with nuclear Russia on its doorstep to the last Ukrainian, and that's our position. Yeah. And one of the things that nobody asks is, what is the wherewithal, the means to the end of the Biden plan? Is it, how would you get Russia out of the Donbass and the Crimea? And I've asked this question to a lot of colleagues at the Hoover Institution and in policy positions, and they all say the same thing. A, you have to sink the Black Sea Fleet. B, we have to give them 100 F-16s and maybe 200 to 300 or 1,000 Abrams tanks, and we have to escalate this into the largest, wars on the continent, and it is now already since World War II. But that all assumes that Russia's not going to do something, and they just move nuclear weapons, tactical weapons, into Belarus. So this thing is insidiously escalating every week, and we just keep rah, 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 we're going to do this. And meanwhile, we're exhausting our own arsenals. Taiwan is endangered, and we're divided at home in a way that we've never seen before. So I'm as worried about 7 million illegal entrants across the border and 100,000 people dying of fentanyl coming from the cartels than I am about the borders of Ukraine. I don't know why everybody got so angry at DeSantis. He just said that it was a territorial dispute, and they said, well, no, that it's more than that. Well, yeah, it's more than that, but it started with that. It started with a territorial dispute, so he wasn't inexact.
Yeah. You also, I know you're concerned about this. We're all concerned about it. You also just wrote an article at American Greatness that I think everyone should read. It's called "Who Owns the University?" The Hoover Institution is located at Stanford. Stanford just had a very high-profile incident happen with a federal judge basically shouted down by law students, and those students were then defended and backed up and joined by the Dean of Inclusion and Diversity at Stanford. Yes. This really is, I mean, I don't want to use the term lunatics in asylum, but this is the lunatics running the asylum at places like Stanford.
Yeah, and what in the context of that tragedy we saw in Nashville yesterday, what prompted their hatred of Judge Duncan? He had a case where he was sentencing a convicted pornographer and pedophile, and he didn't buy the pedophile's argument that suddenly he was a woman. Mm-hmm. And he didn't buy that because that's an effort to get into the women's area of prison in many cases. And that set off the law students. But it raised a larger question. Why do these students who are passing through in a transitory fashion for 3 or 4 years, 3 years at the law school, 4 undergraduate, believe the university belongs to them? The taxpayers give Stanford $1.5 billion in research monies. They underwrite $350 million in federal guaranteed loans. They do not charge any taxes for $2 billion on the endowment income for ostensibly a nonprofit and disinterested university. I'm not sure that's true. And then we have the donors. We have the alumni that give it. It doesn't belong to a bunch of young students at this law school for 3 years. That's the way that they speak for Stanford. Yeah. And I think Stanford's learning. I think the dean of the law school, Jenny Martinez, is starting to learn the reaction from the alumni, the donor class. The U.S. taxpayer is trying to tell her that these young kids that violently disrupted a judge do not own your university, and you should not let them own your
You call university. You call it megalomania. It's clearly narcissism. What concerns me about it is, everyone's saying, oh, these are future lawyers. No, actually, these are future judges. These are future senators that we're seeing here. These are future board members and CEOs. And we're all going to have to reap the repercussions of this unless the grown-ups in the room actually pull it back. Is there stomach for that?
No, not yet. And we got to remember, especially, that one of the ironies is when they have a very exalted and inflated sense of themselves. One of them yelled out to Judge Duncan, "You wouldn't get into Stanford," but what he didn't yell was that the first class that has come in under repertory or compensatory admissions at Stanford took the bar last summer, and the flunk rate, that is, the people who flunked the bar, California bar at Stanford, was usually about 3 or 4%. It went up to 14% in a single year.
Wow. So
the law school itself is losing its sheen and its prestige because of its admissions and its curricula policies that are woke. And they're not. And so a lot of this anger you see from these students is an expression of both their arrogance and ignorance. They're not being well trained, and a lot of them would not have entered Stanford under the very criteria that they felt was necessary 4 or 5 years ago to enter the university.
And this isn't a one-off at Stanford either. We saw similar behavior at Georgetown Law here in D.C. We've seen it from Yale as well. I'm thinking as soon as these lawyers when they get out of law school and they're not brought in as clerks at the Supreme Court or federal law, that's when things start to change. That's when these faculties start changing things. Sadly, we have to leave it there. I always want to talk to you for at least an hour, so maybe we can schedule that in the future. Victor Davis Hanson, Hoover Institution.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Always great stuff. And I commend these articles for you to read. Who Owns the University, as I mentioned. And at the Las Vegas Review-Journal, everyone, please read VDH's take on the war in Ukraine. There's more to come. Keep it here on O'Connor Tonight.